There are nights when your body is resting, but your heart refuses to rest. A memory comes back without permission. A person you thought you moved on from suddenly feels alive again in your thoughts. And in that silence, you start asking yourself a question you cannot ignore anymore. Why is this still happening? Why does their presence still return when your life has already moved forward? But what if the truth is deeper than heartbreak? What if Allah is not letting you forget them, not to hurt you, but to guide your heart towards something you were never seeing before? Yourself, your attachment, and your dependence on Him. Your heart is still attached because it never surrendered them to Allah. When you keep someone in your heart but never truly place that attachment in the hands of Allah, the connection does not fully end inside you, even if everything outside your life has already changed. Time moves forward, days become months, and life's going, but something within your thoughts stays behind, stuck in the same emotional place. It keeps returning again and again, not because you are meant to suffer forever, but because something important inside you was never completed. That completion is surrender. In Islam, the heart is not meant to carry people in a way that replaces trust in Allah. You can love, you can feel, and you can be deeply attached, but your heart was never meant to hold anything above Allah's will. When a person becomes deeply rooted in your emotions, but you never consciously hand that situation over to Allah, the heart keeps trying to process it on its own. And the heart alone was never strong enough to carry that weight forever. That is why thoughts don't stop easily. It is not just memory. It is attachment that has not been released in the right way. You may try to distract yourself. You may try to move on. You may even try to force forgetting. But deep inside, the heart is still holding something it was never fully ready to let go of in front of Allah. Real healing in Islam is not about erasing someone from your memory. It is about changing where that memory sits in your heart. When you finally reach the point where you say, with honesty and submission, that, Ya Allah, this is no longer in my control, I leave it with you, something begins to shift. Not instantly, not magically, but deeply and quietly over time. Because when you surrender a person to Allah, you are no longer trying to carry the outcome yourself. You are no longer replaying what happened, what could have happened, or what should have happened. You are no longer fighting your own heart in silence. Instead, you are trusting that Allah already knows what you do not know, sees what you cannot see, and decides in ways that are always better than what you could have chosen for yourself. And slowly, that is when peace starts entering. Not because the memory disappears, but because it no longer controls your emotions the same way. The heart becomes lighter, not because it forgot, but because it finally accepted that everything is now in the hands of Allah. Real peace is not when you stop thinking about them completely. Real peace is when thinking about them no longer breaks you, because your heart has learned to trust Allah more than it trusts its own longing. But your heart is still attached, because it never surrendered them to Allah. When you keep someone in your heart but never truly place that attachment in the hands of Allah, the connection does not fully end inside you, even if everything outside your life has already changed. Time moves forward, days become months, and life keeps going. But something within your thoughts stays behind, stuck in the same emotional place. It keeps returning again and again, not because you are meant to suffer forever, but because something important inside you was never completed. That completion is surrender. In Islam, the heart is not meant to carry people in a way that replaces trust in Allah. You can love, you can feel, and you can be deeply attached, but your heart was never meant to hold anything above Allah's will. When a person becomes deeply rooted in your emotions, but you never consciously hand that situation over to Allah, the heart keeps trying to process it on its own, and the heart alone was never strong enough to carry that weight forever. That is why thoughts don't stop easily. It is not just memory. It is attachment that has not been released in the right way. You may try to distract yourself, you may try to move on, you may even try to force forgetting. But deep inside, the heart is still holding something it was never fully ready to let go of in front of Allah. Real healing in Islam is not about erasing someone from your memory. It is about changing where that memory sits in your heart. When you finally reach the point where you say, with honesty and submission, that, Ya Allah, this is no longer in my control, I leave it with you, something begins to shift. Not instantly, not magically, but deeply and quietly over time. Because when you surrender a person to Allah, you are no longer trying to carry the outcome yourself. You are no longer replaying what happened. what could have happened, or what should have happened. You are no longer fighting your own heart in silence. Instead, you are trusting that Allah already knows what you do not know, sees what you cannot see, and decides in ways that are always better than what you could have chosen for yourself. And slowly, that is when peace starts entering. Not because the memory disappears, but because it no longer controls your emotions the same way. The heart becomes lighter, not because it forgot, but because it finally accepted that everything is now in the hands of Allah. Real peace is not when you stop thinking about them completely. Real peace is when thinking about them no longer breaks you, because your heart has learned to trust Allah more than it trusts its own longing. Allah is showing you where your heart placed more value than it should have. Sometimes Allah does not immediately take a feeling away from your heart, not because He wants to hurt you, but because He wants to show you something very important about yourself. He wants you to see where your heart became too attached, where your emotions became too dependent, and where your love slowly crossed a line without you even noticing. There are moments in life when a person becomes so important to you that your thoughts begin to revolve around them. Your mood starts depending on them. Your peace starts feeling connected to them, and slowly, without realizing it, your heart begins to give them a space that was never meant to be that large. This is not always intentional. It happens quietly, over time, through attention, hope, connection, and emotion. But when that attachment becomes too strong, Allah, in His wisdom, allows you to feel its weight, not to humiliate you and not to break you, but to make you aware. Because a heart that starts valuing a creation too deeply needs a gentle reminder of balance. And that reminder often comes through longing, through thoughts that won't stop, and through emotions that refuse to fully settle. This is not a punishment. It is guidance in a different form. Allah is showing you where your heart leaned too much, where your emotions became stronger than your trust, and where your dependence slowly shifted away from Him without you realizing it. Because the truth is, the heart was never created to be fully satisfied by any person. People can give moments of happiness, comfort, and care, but they cannot carry the weight of your entire emotional world. When you expect that from them, your heart eventually becomes restless, even if the relationship is gone. That restlessness is not random. It is a signal, a quiet reminder that something in your attachment needs correction. And sometimes Allah allows that person to stay in your thoughts, not because they are meant for you, but because the feeling they left behind is meant to wake you up. So you start asking deeper questions. Why do I think about them so much? Why can't I fully move on? Why does my heart still feel tied? And through these questions, your awareness begins to grow. Because Allah is not only removing people from your life or keeping them in your memory for no reason. He is teaching you where your emotional priorities went out of balance. He is gently showing you that the heart feels pain when it depends too heavily on anything other than Him. And if you reflect honestly, you may begin to see that some of your strongest emotional pain did not come from love alone, but from expectation, from hope, from imagining a future your heart became attached to. And when reality did not match that imagination, the heart kept holding on to the idea, even when the situation was already gone. This is where Allah's wisdom becomes clear. He allows you to feel that emptiness, so you understand that nothing and no one is meant to replace your connection with Him. Because when the heart becomes too attached to a creation, peace starts to disappear slowly, even if the person is no longer present. Real balance returns when you start recognizing this truth. When you realize that your heart was never meant to depend so heavily on someone who is also weak, also temporary, and also dependent on Allah. And instead of blaming yourself, you start correcting your direction, because Allah is not exposing your weakness to break you. He is exposing it to guide you back to balance, back to clarity, back to Him. The memory returns because the lesson inside it has not been fully realized. Sometimes you think moving on means the memory should disappear completely. But in reality, the mind does not always repeat a memory just to remind you of a person. Sometimes it repeats it because there is something inside that memory you still have not fully understood. Something your heart saw but did not fully process. Something your emotions felt but your wisdom has not yet fully accepted. That is why it comes back at unexpected times. At night, in silence, when everything is calm. Not because you are going backwards, but because there is still a part of you that is trying to make sense of what happened. The heart is not just remembering the person. It is trying to complete an understanding that was left unfinished inside you. In Islam, nothing that happens to the heart is meaningless. Even emotional pain carries lessons. Even attachment carries awareness. And even heartbreak carries hidden wisdom. But wisdom only becomes clear when the lesson is truly understood, not just experienced. And many times, people experience something deeply, but they never pause long enough to understand what Allah was trying to teach them through it. So the memory returns, not to trap you, but to guide you back to reflection. It keeps showing up because there is something inside that experience that you have not fully accepted yet. Maybe it was a boundary you ignored. Maybe it was a sign you did not notice. Maybe it was a truth you avoided because it was too painful at the time. And until that truth is faced with honesty, the mind keeps revisiting it. Not because the past is calling you back, but because understanding is still incomplete. It is like a lesson in a book you read too quickly. You saw the words, but you did not absorb the meaning, so you keep returning to it without realizing why. Allah allows this repetition not to punish your heart, but to complete your awareness. Because Allah does not only want you to move on emotionally, He wants you to grow mentally and spiritually from what you went through. And growth does not come from forgetting. It comes from understanding. Sometimes the real lesson is not about the person at all. It is about you, how you attached, how you trusted, how you ignored your own signs, how you gave too much without balance, and how your heart became more invested than your wisdom could protect. And when you finally begin to see that, something shifts inside you. The memory does not feel the same anymore. It stops feeling like a wound and starts feeling like a lesson. Not because the pain was small, but because the meaning becomes clear. And clarity always reduces emotional weight. That is why Allah allows certain memories to return. Not to keep you stuck, but to make sure you do not waste the lesson hidden inside them. Because a life experience without understanding becomes repetition. But a life experience with understanding becomes growth. And slowly, when you start reflecting instead of resisting, when you start asking what Allah wanted you to learn instead of why it happened, the memory begins to lose its control over you. Not because it disappears, but because it finally fulfills its purpose inside you. What you believe you lost may actually be Allah's protection from you. There are moments in life when the heart is convinced it has lost something precious. A person, a connection, a future, or a dream that once felt so real inside your imagination. At first, it feels like something has been taken away from you unfairly. The mind keeps replaying what could have been, what should have been, and what never became reality. And in that space of emotional confusion, it becomes very hard to see the bigger picture. But in Islam, not every ending is a loss, and not every separation is a punishment. Sometimes what the heart calls loss is actually protection from Allah in a form you did not recognize at the time. Because Allah does not only give through what remains in your life, He also protects through what is removed from it. The human heart is limited. It only sees the present feeling, the immediate pain, and the visible absence. But Allah sees the entire path ahead. He sees the outcomes you cannot see, the consequences you cannot predict, and the emotional harm that may have come later if things had continued. And sometimes, out of mercy, He gently removes something before it becomes something that breaks you in a deeper way. That is why some memories feel painful, not because they were meant for you, but because your heart formed an attachment to something that was never stable for your long-term peace. The heart remembers the good moments, the comfort, the hope, and the emotional highs. But it does not always see the imbalance, the confusion, or the harm that was also present in ways you did not fully notice. So when Allah takes something away, the heart naturally feels the absence more than the wisdom behind it. It feels the silence, not the protection. It feels the distance, not the wisdom. And that is where struggle begins. Because the heart is grieving something it believes it needed, while Allah is protecting it from something it was never meant to carry forever. Sometimes what you thought was your biggest emotional connection was actually a test of attachment. A test of how deeply your heart can become attached to something temporary. And when Allah removes it, He is not taking happiness away from you. He is redirecting your heart away from dependence on something that cannot sustain your peace. And if you reflect deeply, there are often signs you may have ignored at the time. Moments of confusion, emotional instability, uncertainty that you tried to overlook because your feelings were stronger than your clarity. But Allah never ignores those signs. He sees the full reality from the beginning. That is why later, when distance creates clarity, you begin to see things differently. What once felt perfect starts revealing its limitations. What once felt like destiny starts feeling like attachment. And what once felt like unbearable loss slowly begins to feel like unexpected protection, because Allah's protection is not always comfortable. Sometimes it feels like emptiness. Sometimes it feels like loneliness. Sometimes it feels like unanswered questions. But behind all of that is a wisdom that is far greater than what the heart can understand in the moment. And as time passes, you may begin to notice something very important. The version of you that once could not imagine life without that person starts becoming stronger without them. Your heart begins to breathe again. Your thoughts begin to settle, and your dependence slowly shifts away from something that once consumed you emotionally. This is not accidental. This is Allah replacing emotional attachment with awareness. He is showing you that your survival, your peace, and your identity were never meant to depend on any one person. They were always meant to remain connected to Him first. And when you finally understand this, the pain does not feel like betrayal anymore. It feels like protection that you did not recognize at the time, because Allah did not take something from you to leave you empty. He removed it to protect your heart from something you could not yet see. Your emotional pain is Allah softening your heart and breaking what hurts you. There are moments in life when your heart feels heavy in a way you cannot explain. You are not just thinking, you are feeling deeply. Something inside you feels broken, restless, and unsettled. And at times you may even wonder why Allah allows you to feel this emotional pain for so long. But in Islam, not every pain is meaningless, and not every broken feeling is a sign of loss. Sometimes it is a sign of healing that you do not yet understand. Emotional pain often comes when the heart is holding on to something too tightly. A person, a memory, an expectation, or a hope that became too important in your inner world. And when the heart becomes too attached to something temporary, Allah, in His wisdom, begins to gently loosen that attachment. Not by force, but through feelings that slowly change the direction of your heart. At first, it feels like sadness, then it feels like confusion, then it becomes reflection. And slowly, without you even realizing it, your heart starts to soften. Not in a weak way, but in a way that removes hardness, dependence, and emotional intensity that was not meant to stay forever. Because sometimes the heart becomes too firm in its attachment. It begins to rely on something other than Allah for emotional stability. And Allah, out of mercy, does not leave the heart in that state. He allows emotional discomfort so the heart can break free from what is silently hurting it. This is why emotional pain in Islam is not always destruction. Sometimes it is purification. It is Allah removing what is deeply rooted in your emotions, but not good for your long-term peace. And this process is not sudden. Slowful. It is slow because the heart needs time to adjust, understand, and release. When you are alone with your thoughts at night, when the silence feels heavy, when memories return without permission, these are not random moments. They are moments where your heart is being trained to detach from dependency and return to reliance on Allah. Because in those quiet moments, you are no longer distracted by the world. You are left with yourself and with Allah. And in that state, something begins to change inside you. The pain you feel slowly turns into awareness. You begin to see that what hurt you was not only the absence of a person, but the depth of attachment you built around them. And that realization itself becomes the beginning of healing. Because Allah does not break the heart without purpose. He does not allow pain without wisdom. When the heart feels like it is breaking, it is often because something false inside it is being removed. False expectations, false hopes, false dependence. Things that felt comforting, but were never meant to stay forever. And as this emotional process continues, the heart slowly becomes softer. Softer not in weakness, but in humility. Softer in remembrance of Allah. Softer in understanding that not everything it desires is meant for it, and not everything it loses is a punishment. You begin to realize that emotional pain is not just about what left your life. It is also about what Allah is removing from your heart. Attachment that was too strong. Expectations that were too heavy, emotions that were too dependent on something fragile. And when that softness finally settles in, something beautiful happens. Your heart becomes more aware of Allah than before, more dependent on Him, more honest in its need for Him. Because pain, when understood correctly, always leads the heart back to its true source of peace. And slowly, you understand that what you called heartbreak was actually Allah shaping your heart into something more sincere, more grounded, and more connected to Him. than it was before. You are not thinking about them, you are thinking about what you felt with them. There is a moment in healing where you begin to realize something very important about your own heart. You are not always missing a person the way you think you are. You are missing a feeling that once made you feel seen, connected, important, or emotionally alive in a way you may not have felt before or after. And when that feeling disappears, the mind naturally tries to find it again through memory. That is why the thoughts return, especially at night, not because the person still has power over your life, but because your heart is trying to recreate an emotional state it once experienced. The comfort, the attention, the excitement, the hope, or even the sense of belonging that came with them becomes something the mind keeps replaying. But over time, you start to confuse the feeling with the person themselves. In Islam, the heart is deeply emotional, but it is also easily influenced by attachment. And when something touches the heart strongly, the memory does not just store the person, it stores the emotion connected to them. That is why even after separation, the feeling remains active long after the situation has ended. But Allah, in His wisdom, allows you to experience this confusion so you can slowly understand the difference between attachment and reality. Because what feels like longing for a person is often the heart searching for emotional fulfillment that it once associated with them. If you reflect honestly, you may notice that what hurts most is not always the absence of the person, but the absence of how you felt when they were around. The sense of being valued, the feeling of closeness, the emotional comfort, or the hope of something meaningful developing. These feelings create a strong imprint on the heart, and the heart keeps returning to them without realizing it. This is where Allah begins to guide your awareness, because when you realize you are not actually missing a person but a feeling, your understanding of your own emotions starts to change. You begin to see that emotional attachment is not always about who someone is, but what they represented in your inner world. And sometimes that representation becomes larger than reality itself. You start remembering only the moments that gave you comfort, while slowly forgetting the confusion, imbalance, or emotional instability that may have also existed. The mind naturally edits memory to protect the heart, but in doing so, it sometimes deepens attachment. That is why healing requires honesty, not just with the situation, but with yourself. Because when you begin to separate the feeling from the person, you start to regain control over your emotional state. You realize that no human being is meant to carry the full weight of your emotional world, and slowly, Allah uses this awareness to bring balance back to your heart. He shows you that emotions are temporary, and that no feeling is meant to become your permanent source of peace. Because if peace depends on a feeling tied to a creation, it will always rise and fall. But if peace is tied to Allah, it becomes stable even when feelings change. As this understanding deepens, the emotional intensity begins to reduce. The memories lose their sharpness. The thoughts lose their grip. Not because you forced yourself to forget, but because you finally understood what your heart was actually holding on to. And when that realization settles, something shifts inside you. You stop chasing the past version of a feeling and start recognizing the present reality. You begin to see that what you thought was love, or loss, or longing was actually your heart trying to return to an emotional state that can never fully exist again in the same way. Because moments are not repeatable. Yet, feelings change, people change, and your heart also changes. And Allah allows you to see this so you stop searching for permanent peace in temporary experiences. And when you finally understand this, the attachment begins to loosen naturally. Not because the memory is gone, but because you are no longer confusing the feeling with the person. And in that clarity, your heart slowly returns to a place of balance, awareness, and deeper reliance on Allah. Allah distances you from distractions so you can return to your true identity. There are moments in life when certain people are no longer part of your present, yet they still remain alive in your thoughts. And at first, this feels confusing, because you may wonder why someone who is no longer in your life still has space inside your mind. But in Islam, even emotional distance carries wisdom. Nothing that happens to the heart is without purpose, even when it feels painful or unclear. Sometimes Allah removes people from your daily life, not only to end a connection, but to end a version of you that was slowly forming around that connection. Because over time, when your emotions become deeply attached to someone, your identity can begin to revolve around them without you realizing it. Your thoughts, your energy, your expectations, and even your emotional stability start adjusting around that presence. But when Allah steps in and creates distance, something very important happens. The outer attachment breaks, but the inner reflection begins. You are left with yourself again, without distraction, without emotional dependency, without the constant influence of another person shaping your inner world. And in that space, you begin to see things more clearly than before. At first, this clarity feels uncomfortable because the heart is used to being emotionally occupied. It is used to thinking, hoping, expecting, and replaying. But when those distractions are removed, silence replaces noise. And in that silence, you begin to hear your own thoughts more clearly than you ever did before. And this is where Allah begins to guide you back to your true identity. The identity that is not dependent on anyone's presence or absence. The identity that is not defined by emotional attachment. The identity that exists in its pure form, connected directly to Allah, not filtered through another human being. Because sometimes relationships and emotional attachments slowly shift a person's focus away from themselves and even away from Allah without them noticing. Not because the connection is always wrong, but because human attachment is powerful. It can quietly take space in the heart that was meant for reflection, purpose, and spiritual awareness. So when Allah removes distractions, He is not taking something away to leave you empty. He is creating space for you to see who you are without emotional noise, without dependence, without the constant pull of memory or expectation. And in that space, something begins to return to you: your awareness of yourself, your ability to think clearly again, your emotional independence, and most importantly, your connection with Allah becomes more visible again, because it is no longer hidden behind intense emotional attachment. You start realizing that much of your emotional confusion did not come from loss itself, but from losing yourself inside the connection. And when that connection is removed, you slowly begin to rediscover parts of yourself that were always there, but were not being fully expressed. This is not an instant transformation. It happens quietly, over time. You begin to notice that your emotions are not as controlled by memories as they once were. You begin to notice that your identity is not as dependent on one person's presence as it used to be. And slowly, your heart becomes more stable again, because Allah is not only removing what distracts you, He is restoring what belongs to you. Your clarity, your self-awareness, your emotional balance, and your connection to Him without interference. And when this process completes, you realize something very powerful: that your true identity was never lost. It was only covered by attachment. And when Allah removes that attachment, He is not changing who you are. He is bringing you back to who you were meant to be in the first place. What stays in your heart may still be, under Allah's perfect timing and plan. There are moments when your heart feels like it cannot let go, no matter how much time passes or how much life changes around you. You may think you have moved forward, yet something inside still holds on quietly. A memory that refuses to fade, a feeling that returns without warning, a name that still echoes in your thoughts when everything becomes silent. And in that silence, you begin to wonder why it is still there. In Islam, not everything that remains in the heart is a sign that something is meant to return in the same way you imagine. Sometimes, what remains is simply under Allah's timing, because Allah does not work according to emotional urgency. He works according to wisdom, balance, and perfect timing that the human heart cannot fully see in the moment. Your heart wants answers quickly. It wants closure immediately. It wants clarity now so it can finally rest. But Allah's plan does not always give instant relief. Sometimes He allows things to stay in your heart longer than expected, not to confuse you, but to shape you, to prepare you, to strengthen your trust in what you cannot yet understand. Because if everything became clear too quickly, you would not develop patience. You would not develop reliance on Allah. You would not learn how to carry uncertainty without losing your peace. And sometimes that is exactly what Allah is teaching you through delayed clarity. What stays in your heart may not always be a sign of unfinished love. It may be a sign of unfinished understanding, a reminder that not everything is meant to be solved by emotion alone. Some things are meant to be placed in Allah's hands and left there until He unfolds them in the way that is best for you. And as time passes, you may begin to notice something subtle but powerful. The intensity in your heart starts to change. The pain that once felt sharp becomes softer. The thoughts that once controlled you start to lose their grip, not because the memory disappeared, but because your heart is slowly learning to trust Allah's timing more than its own desire for immediate answers. This is where true surrender begins. Not when you finally understand everything, but when you accept that you do not need to understand everything to be at peace. You stop forcing closure. You stop chasing explanations. You stop trying to rewrite what already happened in your mind, and instead, you begin to place it in Allah's hands with sincerity. Because Allah's timing is never random. If something is meant to return, it will return in a way that does not confuse your heart. And if something is not meant for you, it will eventually fade in a way that protects your heart from future harm. But both outcomes come from the same source, Allah's perfect wisdom. And sometimes, what lingers in your heart is not meant to stay as pain forever. It is meant to stay as a reminder that your heart is still learning how to fully trust Allah with what it cannot control. Because control is what creates anxiety, but surrender is what brings peace. So instead of asking why it is still in your heart, you slowly begin to ask a different question. What is Allah teaching me through this stillness? What is He preparing me for through this delay? What wisdom is hidden inside this emotional waiting? And that shift alone begins to change everything inside you. Because when the heart finally stops fighting the timing of Allah, it starts to find rest in it. And in that rest, something beautiful happens. The memory no longer feels like a burden. It feels like a sign that your story is still being written with care, even if you cannot see the next chapter yet. And when you reach that understanding, you realize that what stayed in your heart was never meant to trap you. It was meant to teach you how to trust Allah, even when your heart does not have answers. And maybe now you understand. It was never just about them. It was about what Allah was doing inside you while you were still thinking it was about someone else. Because hearts don't heal only by forgetting. They heal when they learn where to place their weight and who to trust when nothing makes sense anymore. So if their memory still visits you, don't panic. Don't fight yourself. Don't assume you are going backwards. Some hearts take longer to learn where peace truly comes from. And slowly, quietly, Allah begins to replace what hurt you with something softer, something calmer, something that does not leave when everything else leaves. Because what was meant for you will never confuse your heart for too long, and what was never meant for you will eventually lose its grip, no matter how strong it once felt. So rest your heart in this truth. Not everything you feel is a sign to return. Sometimes it is a sign that you are finally being guided away from what was never meant to stay and toward the one who never leaves you at all.